The hearing room on Capitol Hill had been tense for hours, but nobody, not the cameras, not the journalists crowding the press gallery, not even the most seasoned political veterans in the room, was ready for what was about to happen. Jasmine Crockett, a first-term Congresswoman from Texas, sat at the curved dais with a legal pad in front of her and a look of absolute calm on her face. Across the room, Jim Jordan, one of the most powerful and loudest voices in the House, was in the middle of what he believed was an airtight argument. He leaned into the microphone, his jacket off as always, sleeves rolled up, voice rising with the confidence of a man who rarely gets stopped. And then Crockett stopped him completely, publicly, and on the record. If you want to see how one congresswoman turned a congressional hearing into the most watched political moment of the week, keep watching. And before we go any further, hit that subscribe button and like this video so you never miss a story like this one. It was a Wednesday morning in Washington, D.C., and the House Judiciary Committee had convened for what was supposed to be a routine oversight hearing. The topic on paper was dry: federal law enforcement procedures and prosecutorial discretion. But in the current political climate, nothing in Washington stays dry for long. Jim Jordan had called the hearing himself. As the committee chairman, he had made oversight hearings a signature tool, a way to put pressure on the Biden administration's Department of Justice, to question federal prosecutors, and to build a political narrative that his base found compelling. He was good at it, experienced, relentless, and skilled at the kind of prosecutorial questioning that sounds convincing on camera even when the underlying logic has gaps. He had done this dozens of times. He knew how to control a room. Jasmine Crockett, by contrast, was in just her second year in Congress. Before that, she was a defense attorney in Dallas, Texas, someone who had spent years in actual courtrooms, not just congressional hearing rooms, cross-examining witnesses, challenging evidence, and poking holes in arguments that sounded airtight until they weren't. She had won cases that looked impossible. She had sat across from prosecutors who were older, more experienced, and more powerful than her, and found the weakness in their argument. She brought all of that to Washington with her. And on this particular Wednesday, Jim Jordan was about to find out exactly what that meant. Jordan had been building his argument for several minutes. His claim, laid out in the kind of sweeping language that fills cable news highlight reels, was that federal prosecutors had been weaponized, that the Department of Justice under Democratic leadership had selectively pursued cases for political reasons. He rattled off statistics. He named names. He pointed to what he called a pattern of bias so obvious that, in his words, any fair-minded American could see it. The room was with him, at least on his side of the aisle. Republican colleagues nodded. Staffers typed quickly. The gallery leaned forward. Jordan built to his conclusion with the momentum of a man who believes he has already won the argument before the other side speaks. Then Crockett leaned into her microphone. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't wave papers dramatically. She spoke the way a lawyer speaks when they have already done the work, and they know exactly where the thread is that unravels everything. She said, calmly and clearly, that she wanted to address the chairman's argument directly. She acknowledged that the statistics he had cited sounded significant. She even agreed that the question of prosecutorial discretion was a legitimate and serious one. And then she started asking questions, not rhetorical ones designed to score points, but the kind of precise, methodical questions that a defense attorney uses to expose the difference between what something looks like and what it actually is. She asked about the source of his statistics. He cited a report. She asked which version of the report, noting that the updated analysis had different conclusions. He paused. She asked whether the cases he had named shared specific legal characteristics that would make the comparison he was drawing valid, or whether they were different enough that the comparison collapsed under scrutiny. He started to answer. She waited, then pointed out that two of the cases he had used as examples had, in fact, been initiated under previous administrations, a detail that directly contradicted the timeline his entire argument rested on. The room shifted. You could hear it, that particular silence that falls when something important has just been said and everyone is processing what it means. Jordan pushed back. That was expected. He is not a man who concedes easily, and he has been in contentious hearings before. He reframed his point, moved to a different example, and tried to steer the conversation back to the broader narrative. Crockett followed him there too. She had done the homework. Every pivot he made, she had anticipated. Every new example he offered, she had a specific, factual response to. She was not speculating, not editorializing, not performing outrage for the cameras. She was lawyering in the truest sense of the word, with the kind of surgical precision that does not leave the other side much room to maneuver. The exchange escalated. Jordan, visibly frustrated, raised his voice, which is his default mode but which now had an edge of genuine irritation in it. He accused her of deflecting. He said she was avoiding the substance of the argument. Crockett looked directly at him and said, in a tone that was measured but unmistakably pointed, that she was not deflecting anything. She was responding, she said, to what he had actually argued, not what he wished he had argued. If the chairman had stronger evidence, she added, she would be happy to examine that instead. The implication that the argument as presented did not have stronger evidence landed in the room like a stone in still water. Ripples everywhere. Other members of the committee began reacting. Democrats who had been quiet leaned forward, energized. Republicans who had been nodding now looked uncertain, checking their notes, exchanging glances. The witnesses seated at the table below the dais, who had come prepared to answer questions about federal law enforcement policy, were now barely part of the hearing at all. The moment had taken on a life of its own. A Capitol Hill staffer watching from the gallery would later describe it as one of those rare hearings where you can feel the power in the room actually shifting in real time. Crockett was not finished. She had one more move, and it was the kind of move that only works if you have been patient enough to wait for exactly the right moment. Jordan, in his frustration, had made a broad, declarative statement, the kind of sweeping claim that sounds powerful in a speech, but becomes vulnerable the moment someone asks for specifics. He said that the pattern of bias he was describing was well documented and undeniable. Crockett picked up that phrase like a piece of evidence at trial. She asked quietly for him to name a single documented case that met all of the criteria his own argument required, a case initiated by the current DOJ, targeting a political opponent without a legitimate legal basis that had been independently verified. She was specific. She listed the criteria clearly. She gave him a moment to respond. He did not name one. He pivoted to a general statement about the overall political climate. Crockett nodded slowly and said, for the record, that she had asked for a specific example and had not received one. She said she was not saying such examples did not exist. She was saying they had not been presented to the committee. She said that without specific, verifiable evidence meeting those criteria, the chairman's argument, however passionately made, was not an argument that could be called documented or undeniable. It was a characterization, an allegation, a narrative, not a finding. The room went chaotic. Not chaotic the way a riot is chaotic, but chaotic the way a hearing room gets when everyone is trying to talk at once and the chairman has lost control of the agenda. Multiple members sought recognition from the chair at the same time. Staff members moved quickly across the floor. Someone in the gallery began speaking and was immediately shushed by the sergeant-at-arms. Jordan, now fully off his prepared script, tried to regain the floor by simply talking louder, a technique that works in many rooms but did not work in this one, because Crockett had the microphone and the procedural right to finish her time. She used every second of it. By the time the gavel finally brought things back to order, the narrative of the hearing had completely changed. Jordan had called the session to make a case about prosecutorial bias. He would leave it having to answer questions about why his central argument had not held up under direct examination. Crockett, who had not been the headline name coming into the hearing, was now the person everyone was talking about. The clip moved fast. Within an hour of the exchange, the key moments had been posted across X, formerly Twitter, YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram. The posting was not just from partisan accounts. It was from legal analysts, political journalists, and ordinary viewers who simply found the exchange remarkable regardless of their political leaning. A constitutional law professor posted a thread calling Crockett's cross-examination technique textbook impeachment of a narrative-based argument, explaining in plain language why the specific questions she asked were so effective. The thread was shared tens of thousands of times. On X, the hashtags were immediate and overwhelming. Conservatives pushed back, arguing that Crockett was playing procedural games and missing Jordan's broader point. But even within those conversations, there were voices acknowledging that she had done something that is genuinely rare in congressional hearings. She had engaged the argument on its own terms and found where it broke. A Republican-leaning political commentator with a large following wrote, in a post that surprised many of his own followers, that whatever one thought of the politics, case. Crockett's performance was the kind of legislative work Congress is supposed to do. The post got more engagement than almost anything he had posted in months. Democrats were louder and less ambivalent. Prominent members of the progressive wing called her performance a turning point. The Congressional Black Caucus shared a clip with a caption that simply read, "That's our member." The Congressional Progressive Caucus followed minutes later. The chairwoman of the DNC posted that Crockett had shown the country what accountability looks like. Grassroots fundraising emails went out within hours. By end of day, her campaign had reportedly received a notable surge in small dollar donations, the kind of organic surge that cannot be manufactured and that political operatives spend years trying to create. Her colleagues in the legal community, former prosecutors, defense attorneys, law professors, were particularly vocal. Several noted that the precision she brought to the exchange reflected skills that are genuinely difficult to develop and even more difficult to deploy under the pressure of a live congressional hearing. A former federal prosecutor wrote on LinkedIn that what she had done was apply the Daubert standard to a political argument, a reference to the legal test used to assess the reliability of expert testimony, and that it had worked exactly as it does in court. It had exposed the difference between an argument that feels compelling and one that is actually supported by evidence. The post was shared widely and introduced many non-lawyers to why the exchange had been so technically significant. Jordan's team was not silent. They pushed back through conservative media channels, arguing that Crockett had cherry-picked procedural details to avoid engaging with the substance of what the chairman was saying. Fox News ran segments calling the exchange an example of Democrats lawyering their way out of accountability. Several conservative commentators argued that her questions, while technically pointed, were designed to muddy the waters rather than genuinely illuminate the issue. These were not fringe voices. They represented a coherent counter-narrative, and they found an audience among viewers who had been following Jordan's oversight work and believed in the broader case he was making. But the counter-narrative had a structural problem. It was arguing about intent and framing rather than evidence, which was exactly the distinction Crockett had drawn attention to in the first place. Every response that said she was avoiding the substance could be met with the recording, which showed her asking for substance directly and not receiving it. The tape was not ambiguous. This is the particular challenge of losing an argument on the record in a live hearing. You can dispute the interpretation, but the record of what was said and what was not said is fixed. For Jim Jordan, this was an unusual moment. He is one of the most experienced investigators on Capitol Hill. He has put witnesses, officials, and political opponents on the defensive in dozens of high-profile hearings. Being on the defensive himself, not just frustrated, but visibly unable to answer a direct question, was a dynamic his audience was not used to seeing. Political analysts began noting that the exchange had done something strategically significant. It had demonstrated that the oversight narrative Jordan had been building was not airtight. It had shown in public that the evidentiary foundation of that narrative could be challenged in ways his team had apparently not prepared for. For Crockett, the moment was a kind of crystallization. She had already been known in progressive circles as a sharp and outspoken member. She had made news before for pointed floor speeches and for her willingness to challenge her Republican colleagues directly. But this was different. This was not a speech. It was a live exchange under pressure against one of the most experienced members of the House on a topic that required technical mastery of legal and procedural detail. She had not just held her own. She had driven the exchange. That is a harder thing to dismiss, and it landed differently with audiences, including audiences that do not typically pay attention to congressional hearings at all. In the days following, the conversation expanded beyond the immediate political news cycle. Legal educators began using the clip in discussions about argumentation and evidentiary standards. Political science professors assigned it as an example of the difference between political performance and legislative substance. A number of high school debate coaches shared it as a case study in how to respond to a sweeping claim with specific methodical questioning. There is something that happens when a moment in politics transcends its immediate partisan context and becomes useful to people who are not primarily political. It tends to mean the moment captured something more fundamental than left versus right, something about how arguments work and how power moves. The deeper story here is one that Americans across the political spectrum are navigating right now, whether they watch congressional hearings or not. The country is in the middle of a profound argument about institutions, about whether the institutions of law, prosecution, oversight, and governance can be trusted, and whether the people who sit in those rooms and represent us are doing work that is real or work that is performance. That is not a new argument, but it has a particular urgency right now, and every moment that touches it, every exchange that tests whether someone's claim is backed by evidence or built on narrative lands with weight that goes beyond the immediate political stakes. Jasmine Crockett walked into that hearing room as a congresswoman that most Americans outside of Texas had not paid much attention to. She walked out of it as someone the country had a clear and documented record of, a record that showed what happens when someone who has spent their professional life in actual courtrooms decides to bring that discipline into the political arena. Jim Jordan walked in as the chairman of the committee and the architect of an oversight narrative that had up to that point moved largely on its own terms. He walked out having to explain in public why a central piece of that narrative had not survived direct examination. The hearing room on Capitol Hill has seen a lot. It has seen great speeches, ugly confrontations, moments of genuine legislative history, and hours upon hours of performance politics that nobody will remember. What happened on that Wednesday morning was something that people will be watching and discussing and learning from for years, not just because of the politics, but because of the craft, because of what it looks like when preparation meets the moment and a person who has done the work refuses to be moved by volume alone. Some arguments are won by being louder, some are won by being more passionate, and some, the ones that actually matter, the ones that change what happens next, are won by being right, being specific, and being patient enough to wait for the exact moment when the other side shows you exactly where the opening is. Jasmine Crockett found it. She used it, and the country watched every second of it live. There is a lesson in this that goes far beyond politics, and it is one that this age group, people who have lived long enough to know the difference between real competence and the appearance of it, will recognize immediately. It does not matter how loud you are if the evidence is not there. It does not matter how many times you have been in the room if the person across from you has done more homework. Respect in any arena, legal, professional, political, personal, is earned by preparation and by the willingness to be specific when specificity is the only thing that matters. Crockett knew that. She had spent her career knowing it, and on a Wednesday morning in Washington, she showed the whole country exactly what that looks like in practice. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to see it. And if you are not subscribed yet, now is the time, because these are the stories that matter, and we are not slowing down. Hit that subscribe button like this video, and we will see you in the next one.